I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I want to welcome everyone to the second presentation in our online conference, The National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. Thank you for attending. And as y'all can tell, this is an online conference. We thought about having it on a 1 day or 2 day basis, but then we decided, no, let's do something different and have it on a weekly basis. So we're having it every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern time, different presentations. But you'll notice that if you look at the schedule, that there is a natural evolution taking place here. It's a thematic conference that is developing a certain theme throughout. And as you go along, the idea is to present the Kennedy assassination in the context of the national security state way of life in a logical, coherent manner. Now, we all know what the mainstream press says about this idea. They say, oh, well, it's a theory. And I think that if you stick with this conference all the way to the end, you will realize that there's no theorizing taking place here, that these are conclusions that many people have reached based on evidence. Specifically evidence, or mostly evidence, from the 1990s, the Assassination Records Review Board, when they forced the national security establishment to disclose records that they had kept secret for 30 years. And this is the evidence that the mainstream press has just chosen to ignore, just acting as if it didn't exist. And I think that as you proceed through this conference, you're going to see the overwhelming evidence that points to the conclusions that have been reached by many of us. I'm pleased to say that we've got 2 new speakers that we're adding to the agenda, powerful speakers. They will be added to the schedule in the next few days, so check it out, the conference schedule at fff.org. So that means that the conference will be extending into May. Now, procedurally, there are 2 buttons that matter to y'all. One is the chat button, and the other is the Q&A button. The chat button, of course, is just for commenting between yourselves, chatting, whatever, discussing. If you want to ask a question, use the Q&A button, and that comes to me, and I'll relay the question to Mike. Now, we're changing our policy. As y'all know, we stayed pretty late last week, and we want to avoid that. And I know that y'all have questions naturally about things that don't pertain necessarily to what the speaker is talking about. Like you want to talk about the autopsy or the medical evidence or the assassination itself. So what we'd like you to do is just wait for those questions until you reach those speakers. Because like I say, we're developing this conference in a very thematic way, very logical way. So if you have questions on the medical evidence, I guarantee you those questions are going to be answered down the road. But if you would just limit your questions to the theme of each night's presentation, I think we'll find it to be much more expeditious, and it'll shorten the program significantly, and everybody can get to bed early. Now, we started out with a talk by Jim DeEugenio, who set the basis for the conference, the introduction to the conference. He talked about John Kennedy's foreign policy before he even became president, before he was even running for president. As he pointed out, the national security establishment's position was that revolutions in third world countries against their colonial masters were communist inspired, and that if they were permitted to succeed, it would mean that the Red Wave, the communist conspiracy that was supposedly based in Moscow, would get closer and closer to enveloping the world, including the United States. As Jim pointed out, Kennedy comes along, even when he was just a US senator, and said, this is a bunch of bull. That these colonial movements, we need to side with them. I mean, these revolutionary movements, we need to side with them against the colonial masters. So this made this guy, who the national security establishment considered was really a real neophyte coming in as president, suspect. Right off the bat, he's suspect, because Kennedy is siding with what they are certain, 100% certain, is a communist front. So tonight, we're going to keep building on what that framework was before Kennedy gets into office. The origins of the national security state, the origins of the Vietnam War, which played a significant role in the Kennedy administration and the aftermath of the Kennedy administration. And we're very pleased and honored to have as our speaker Mike Swanson. You know, FFF gets a lot of books sent to us to review from time to time, and most of them just are not a good fit for FFF. You all know that our mission is to present a principled case for the libertarian philosophy, and most of the books that are sent to us just don't fit. But Mike sent me a copy of his book, The War State, several years ago, and I started to thumb through it thinking, oh, here's a standard one I'm going to have to toss. And I was intrigued. I started perusing. I thought, wow, this is a book worth taking a closer look at. I took it home, and I'd never heard of it. And I couldn't put it down. It just is gripping read, just what I wanted. You know, how did this whole national security state, what Mike calls the war state, that was the title of his book, how did it get started? What are the ramifications of this? And then just, a couple of weeks ago, he released a brand new book, which is really a sequel to that book, called Why the Vietnam War, which is, I think, the only book, as far as I know, that analyzes the origins of the Vietnam War from 45 to 61 in the context of this national security state framework, or a foreign policy of imperialism. So Mike was obviously my logical choice. Ever since then, when his first book came out, we've been good friends, and I asked him to speak at this conference, and he accepted, and we're really excited about it because now we can set the framework. What was Kennedy's foreign policy toward third world nations before he comes into as the president? What is the situation in the context of what was happening before he became president? Mike has a master's of arts degree from the University of Virginia. When he was getting his PhD, he decided to drop out and enter the investment world. He ran a hedge fund for a few years, and now he's an investment advisor, runs a great website called wallstreetwindow.com. Without any further ado, Mike, it's a pleasure and honor to have you join us. Thank you for doing so.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and everyone that's out there attending this. It's an honor to be here. You've created a powerful lineup of people, and I'm looking forward to everyone's presentations. I watched Diogenio's myself last week. He presented first, and my intention in the way I've crafted this presentation is to make it act as a bridge between his presentation and John Newman's. And I'm going to focus and use the topic of the Vietnam War to explain how the national security state was viewing its interaction with the world as Kennedy came into office, and how his views were different, and how was policy made. I have a PowerPoint I'm going to pop up. Could you enable sharing, screen sharing?
Mike, if you look at your screen on the bottom there should be a share screen. Let me see here.
Yeah, it says it's disabled at the moment.
All right, 1 second here.
Well, as you do it, I'll say that the book I wrote, The War State, it was written in 2013, and I wrote that book to try to write an introduction to the topic and also get myself into it, because even though I'd had a master's degree in history and a lot of interest in the Kennedy assassination and related topics, I got away from all that for about a decade. And between me doing that and writing the book, 9/11 happened, and the idea of the United States being an empire started to be something talked about publicly, and it was a theme I wanted to explore. So I spent some time reading about empires and past history. Then I said, okay, I'm gonna really look at these topics I'd left behind and revisit them and really dig deep into them. And that's how the book, it still says it's disabled here.
Yeah, I'm working on it, Mike. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. How about now?
Yeah, I got it.
All right.
Anyway, I just want to make one point about the book, and it's got a lot of good reviews, but someone wrote a negative review. I mean, there's a few out there, but they make an interesting point, and they say that this book fixated on a few characters, Dulles, Russ, LeMay, Kennedy, some of these, big figures, and it sort of set up a good guy, bad guy setup by doing that. And I would say that when I wrote that book, what I was doing was trying to focus on policy at the level of the leadership. Khrushchev and Castro are also characters in that book. And Eugenio's presentation last week did an excellent job of explaining Kennedy's views when it came to the third world and how they're different than the two Dulles brothers and the administrations that came before them. And this is really the way I think is the best way to delve into the topic to start. If you want to study the Reagan administration, you need to study Ronald Reagan, or if you're looking at the 1980s, if you want to look at 9/11 and Bush and so forth. But there's a deeper level to history and to policy. And that's really why the Vietnam War is about. I'm trying to show in this book how the national security state itself functions, how policies are created and then brought up to the president, how that whole process, I believe, helped make the Vietnam War as we know it or remember it actually occur and play out, and not so much other ways of seeing the Vietnam War, which kind of were popular in the decades, let's say, since 1965. 1965 was the high point of involvement in the war. I believe that's the year that's when the hundreds of thousands of American troops started to come there. And most movies about Vietnam or works about it focus on the years between 65 and 68. And the years before that are kind of forgotten, especially if you get to the 1950s. The farther back you go, the more forgotten it is. And an example of this is the Ken Burns series that came out a couple years ago about Vietnam. Is 11 or 12 episodes, and only one episode was about the period before the Kennedy administration, and then one about him, and then one about 1964 and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The whole rest of it was about all the time period afterwards, when you're talking about a very American involvement that started in 1945, and so it went on for 30 some years, but everyone focuses on 1965 and on, and there's themes that have come out from that era that dominated historical discussion, still do to a certain extent. I'm just going to point a couple of them real quickly. The Best and the Brightest came out in the early 1970s, and it sort of asserted that this was a quagmire that kind of came step by step, slowly, one decision after another, in which the American leaders, and really started with the Best and the Brightest, are really referring to McGeorge Bundy and the people around the Kennedy administration. And he portrays them as believing in not only the American involvement being valid and the right thing to do, but that would be effective. And it sort of sets up the idea that belief persisted and it was false. And the leaders just said, well, okay, this isn't working, so we'll just keep adding and adding to it. And so it was a quagmire. I don't agree with that, as you'll see as we go through this presentation. But another viewpoint that started during the war and continues in some form today was that the war was winnable and we simply didn't do enough. This book, Victory Denied, came out in the 1960s. It was written by a major that was in the Korean War, worked under MacArthur, but a more recent book is this Triumph Forsaken, and it basically makes the same sort of argument that we could have won, our leaders didn't let us win, and then of course there's the other argument that's the opposite, which is that the war was unwinnable when we never should have been there in the first place. And I got a picture of the shooting at Kent State and the peace movement. You know, that was basically their argument. But in the 1980s, you know, we had views that, look, what's going on in the United States is something more sinister than either one of those two arguments. The Iran-Contra scandal implied that, look, there's, you know, secret operations going on. Of course, people were talking about this in the 1970s, but I wasn't, you know, I was just a baby back then. So my consciousness starts about these topics, you know, in the late 1980s. So that's kind of what I remember. And the Platoon movie is something I watched as a kid. But after that, the JFK movie came out, and the release of files and John Newman's work has given us a deeper understanding of the Kennedy era and the Vietnam War. But there's also other scholarship that's going on in the past 10 years that most Americans aren't familiar with. And that's scholarship dealing with what was going on in North Vietnam and even in South Vietnam. And one book is Hanoi's Road to the Vietnam War, which looks at the archives of North Vietnam also to provide a picture of what's going on there. But as far as myself, to set this up, when I wrote the War State book and this Vietnam War book, my intention is to write something that a general audience would enjoy reading, and also would has new information in it that would appeal to people who already have a lot of interest in the topic. You know, I want to try to break new ground and learn things that are new, and also synthesize the literature that's already out there, which in a surprising way, when it comes to Vietnam, no one is, you know, right now, I would say that even though there's actually a huge increase in interest in the Vietnam War, probably because a lot of veterans are getting into their 70s, and there's a lot of people writing memoirs and so forth. Despite a lot of new scholarship about many topics, there isn't a single volume that synthesizes everything together, which is kind of surprising and something that's needed. I'm not trying to attempt that, but it's something someone definitely needs to do. But when I wrote the War State book, the most shocking thing I read, and probably ever read, frankly, is this memo I got on the screen right here, dated 2nd of November, 1962, addressed to the president. It's signed on the bottom by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Maxwell Taylor. And it was done just days after the settlement of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev had released a statement, you know, saying that he's going to bring the missiles back to Cuba. Going into that weekend, Kennedy was under tremendous pressure to bomb Cuba, invade Cuba, and he did a blockade instead, and had negotiations behind the scenes to settle this crisis. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff still wanted to invade Cuba. And Kennedy had McNamara go to them and say, okay, what are the casualty estimates if we do this? And that was done with one little fact that I had no idea about until, you know, I wrote the book and did the research for it. And that is that U-2 spy planes, several days before the day the crisis was settled, had spotted missiles in Cuba that were on trucks. They were called free rocket overground missiles. They had a range of 12 miles. They were land-to-land missiles. And the implications of that were that these missiles could be armed with atomic warheads. And the invasion plans were to send 100,000 Marines into Cuba, like a Normandy-style invasion. And yet here are these rockets with the potential to launch a defensive atomic strike against them. And there's a taped conversation where Kennedy is speaking about this briefly with John McCone, I believe on a Thursday, Friday. So anyway, this memo mentions the possibility that these things have atomic weapons. They don't know for sure, but they're there. And then advocates going ahead with the invasion. They estimate 18,500 Americans would be casualties in the invasion in the first 10 days of the operation. However, they say this is based on the Cubans and the Soviets not using any atomic weapons. If they do use atomic weapons, though, they say our retaliation would be rapid and devastating, and thus would bring to a sudden close the period of heavy losses. And it also says in here that they don't think that these missiles would be used, even if they have them. So therefore, they advocate going ahead with the attack. And so to me, this was one, and still is, one of the most shocking things I've ever read from interviews of Castro and Russians and other scholarship that's come out about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everything suggests that these weapons would have been used. And what's shocking to me is that despite all these risks, they were willing to do it. And so part of my journey in studying these events is partly coming up with an answer of how could they be so willing to do this? On one hand, you know, it seems crazy to risk a complete nuclear war. I mean, we think all the missiles are all, you know, on both sides to be launched would be a complete disaster. But they didn't see it that way, and that's something I hope to show you in this presentation. But to turn back to Vietnam, and then we'll go forward to 1961. Again, this is some of the new scholarship, and the view, this represents what was going on in the Vietnamese side of the story. And just for time, I'll just actually skip it. So anyway, to get back to the Kennan administration, in 1961, and this is where my book actually ends, General Maxwell Taylor and Walter Rostow, they take a trip to South Vietnam, and they come back and they issue this report, and it advocates for 6,000 to 8,000 troops for flood relief. And this is being done in the context of the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Kennedy does not invade Cuba and lets the invasion just be a loss for those that were on the ground. But also, and that happens in April 1961. And at the same time, the same month, there's a crisis in Laos, which we'll get to in a bit, in which Kennedy is under pressure to intervene there too, with ground troops, and in what would be a potential regional war. And he says no to that. And then he sends LBJ to Vietnam, and then Walter Rostow and Maxwell Taylor to Vietnam. And then they come back with the report advocating sending 6,000 to 8,000 troops there. However, the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually want to send a couple 100,000 troops there. And Kennedy doesn't want to send any. In fact, he tells Taylor, I don't want to send troops there. When you go over there, what I want is just a recommendation about basically the overall situation and some smaller changes we can make, send them more aid and assistance, but I don't want to send combat troops there. He basically says this is a mission not to send combat troops, but he comes back saying, let's send 6,000 to 8,000 combat troops. And I believe what he's doing is trying to act in between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Kennedy. The chiefs want hundreds of thousands of troops, Kennedy wants none. So Taylor's sort of creating a political move in between both to try to please both sides. It doesn't actually work. But this period of time, it's not just the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Almost all of Kennedy's civilian advisors in the National Security Council, a couple in the State Department, also want to send combat troops. And their argument is basically, look, we didn't send them in Laos. We didn't, we lost in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, and we just can't keep having losses here. And it's not necessarily simply a loss against the Soviet Union and the communist side, but also, you know, how can you keep backing down against the national security state itself? And this is a quote from one person who is a staffer on the national security state, and he sends this memo to Kennedy. I'm no happier than anyone about getting involved in another squad secondary theater in Asia, but we'll end up doing so sooner or later anyway, because we won't be willing to accept another defeat. If so, the real question is not whether, but how soon and how much. And Kennedy was getting several memos like this and opinions of the same sort. So it's kind of a representative of that. And Walt Rostow, who's on the cover of this excellent biography about him, was one of the leading people doing this. But one of the most shocking things in this Taylor report is an order of battle. This is a military estimate of the force composition on both sides. And he makes an estimate of, okay, what's the enemy got here? And the Central Intelligence Agency, the intelligence community, says there's 14,350 guerrillas in South Vietnam. However, this is a quote, a reserve force of unknown size and capabilities being created in the forests and mountains surrounding the plateau, straddling the Laos and possibly Cambodian border, which offers a supply base, a relatively secure infiltration route, and safe haven. They estimate this is 4,000 men, but the size is unknown, and its capabilities can range from a mere capacity to continue to harass to a capacity when surface of producing a Dien Bien Phu. In other words, there's 14,000 guerrillas in South Vietnam, but right outside on the border, we think there's 4,000 people in reserves, but there could be many, many more. We have no idea. And this force could suddenly appear and create a Dien Bien Phu. And what the Dien Bien Phu was, in 1954, the French forces were put under siege at Dien Bien Phu and surrendered. So he's basically saying that's what could happen. And here's President Kennedy being told to send 6,000 to 8,000 combat troops there, and this could happen. So he ends up rejecting that. He has a meeting in which he says that, this is from notes taken during a national security meeting about the Taylor Rostow report. The president says he's against intervening in an area 10,000 miles away against 16,000 guerrillas with a native army of 200,000, where millions have been spent for years and no success. Kennedy questions the wisdom of involvement in Vietnam, since the basis thereof is not completely clear. The president asked how he could justify the proposed course of action in Vietnam while at the same time ignoring Cuba. General Lemnitzer hastened to add that the Joint Chiefs of Staff feel even at this point the United States should go into Cuba. According to McGeorge Bundy, years later, he says, Kennedy decided sometime in 1961 that he was not going to send combat troops to South Vietnam. So what Kennedy does instead is issue NSAM 111 on November the 22nd, which asserts we're going to have, quote, a joint effort in South Vietnam. That means working with the Diem regime to defend his regime, to build his country. They're going to end up sending advisors, not combat troops, helicopters, and more aid. And that basically stays the policy throughout Kennedy's administration. And when he leaves office, you can read John Newman's book and you'll find that in the final weeks, they say this mission will be completed by 1965, win or lose. And that isn't really changed, I don't believe, to the middle of 1964. So now we're going to jump all the way back to the start of America's involvement in Vietnam and end where we just were a few minutes ago, to draw a circle and with the goal of seeing how the national security state is viewing all this. Why do they really want to send all these people to Vietnam and Laos and get involved in these places when there's many people who doubt it ever be successful? Even these advisors that were telling Kennedy to send these people to Vietnam in 1961 would say, you know, I don't think there's a 50-50 chance we'll win, but we got to do it anyway. George Bundy makes some comment to that effect, and so does his brother. But America's first involvement in Vietnam starts in 1945 with a small OSS contingent, about a dozen men, during the last couple months of World War II. And Vietnam was a French colony. And then when France falls to Germany, the Japanese take it over. They at first let the French run it, the French Vichy government, but then they decide, okay, we don't really trust y'all anymore once France falls. And then they just take it over themselves completely. And they put a lot of the French in jail. And while this is going on, there's a war in China against the Japanese, and American bombers are in the theater operating. So what the OSS wants is some way, mainly to find some forces in Vietnam, indigenous forces that they can work with in order to help rescue any downed pilots that are, you know, getting shot down in the overall theater and end up in Vietnam, and possibly do some sabotage operations against the Japanese forces that are there. And these OSS guys, led by Colonel Archimedes Patty, they go to China on the border of Vietnam and get intelligence about what's going on there. And they find out that the only forces fighting against the Japanese are Ho Chi Minh and his group, which at the time, even though he is a communist, he was trained in the Soviet Union, he's also a nationalist first. And what he really has at the time in 1945 is a coalition. They're not all communists. Some of them are nationalists too. It's just a mix of different groups. But he's the leader of it. He ends up taking the whole thing completely over as the war comes to a close. And then once the Japanese surrender, well, I should add the picture in the top left, what you're seeing there are a couple OSS men that parachute into Vietnam. And there's Ho Chi Minh in the picture on the left, and General Giap on the right. And these guys give the Vietnamese forces arms, radios. They train them to spot weather patterns, to look for downed pilots. And they're only there for a few weeks, and then the war, before the war comes to an end. And interestingly enough, the picture in the bottom right is a photograph of General Giap with Archimedes Patty standing next to them on the left, saluting their flag and the American flag at the same time. There's an army marching past them with both. And Giap turns to him and says, "This is a great honor to be with the first foreigner welcoming our new flag and anthem." So the OSS was at the creation of what later becomes our enemy for 30 some years now. So what ends up happening though is we just have a few men there, and this was a former French colony. The French come, they get their POWs out of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, arm them, and then end up taking over Saigon. And Ho Chi Minh and his forces, they're negotiating over a year or two about the future of Vietnam. Can we remain a French colony? Can we not? But the whole situation breaks down, and then you have a complete war of Ho Chi Minh, Giap, and the French, which the Americans back. However, the OSS guys that were in Vietnam, they say we shouldn't back the French. The first American that dies in Vietnam is an OSS agent named Peter Dewey, and he's the top OSS agent in Saigon. He sees what's going on and sends a memo back to headquarters in the United States saying the French are messing this all up. This is going to be a disaster. We just need to get out of here. And he's driving to the airport to get out of there himself, and he ends up getting shot by one of Ho Chi Minh's forces who mistake him for a Frenchman. And that's the first American casualty in the Vietnam War. But he's not the only one saying we shouldn't be there or we should be on the side of Ho Chi Minh. This is in the first couple months of him, of World War II ending. But the OSS people and a couple State Department people that go and meet Ho Chi Minh have this opinion, but when they send their opinions up to headquarters in 1946, they're rejected. And the argument at the State Department is, look, this Ho Chi Minh and these third world forces like that, okay, there's something more important, and that's the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. And in Europe, General de Gaulle has taken over in France, and they want to get their French colony back. And they tell the Americans in the State Department, look, if you don't give us our French colony back, why should we be allied with you? Maybe we should be just allied with the Soviet Union then. So as part of the Cold War, the US supports the French effort in Vietnam. That's how it starts in order to keep France in the alliance. Although at the start, there is a lot of understanding that Ho Chi Minh is not simply like a puppet of Stalin or China even, but is a bit of an independent actor. That viewpoint, in fact, neither country even recognizes, well, the Soviet Union doesn't recognize his government for several years. Mao Zedong in Red China doesn't take power until a couple years after 1946. And then once they do and recognize Ho Chi Minh, then the State Department gets much more hawkish on him, and then just says flat out, okay, this guy is now basically the enemy. But in between those events, a key turning point in the entire history of our country is the National Security Act of 1947. And it comes, I would say, 12 months after the Cold War really gets going. It creates the Central Intelligence Agency, which the OSS is really a precursor to. It formalizes the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the branches of the armed services, and kind of sets the stage for all the years to come. So here we are, the US is supporting France and Vietnam to the point where we're funding over 60% of the war effort by the middle of the 1950s. And the first picture you see right there, or the biggest picture here, is a photograph of a visit JFK took in 1951 as a congressman to South Vietnam, or excuse me, to Vietnam. It wasn't South and North yet, during the French war against Ho Chi Minh and Giap. And Kennedy is in the background. There's a circle, if you can see it, around his face. And what he finds out on that trip, and is told by a reporter and also someone working in the American embassy there, is that, look, this French effort is pretty much doomed because this is colonialism and it's the past. It really doesn't have a future. And they're not offering the Vietnamese independence. So they don't really have something to fight for. And therefore, this probably isn't going to work. And Kennedy learns from that, comes back home and writes a couple editorials, gives some radio appearances in which he shares these views, and is very critical of the French effort. He says basically the only way the West can succeed in Vietnam is if we give the Vietnamese independence and align ourselves with nationalist forces, which is not, supporting the French isn't going to accomplish that. Well, that's 1951. As the war goes on, the bottom right picture is a photo of France and demonstrations going on against what they call the Dirty War. So the war becomes increasingly unpopular in France, just as the United States will experience, let's say after 1966. And, they're losing basically. So sort of in a desperate play, the general Jean Tassigny, who's in charge of the French forces, he says basically, okay, we have to try to turn around the situation. I want to do one big attack, basically, muster as much resources and aid as we can from the United States, and do one attack and we can win. Privately, he says that he really doesn't think he can win, but he hopes to make a stalemate. And to make a long story short, that ends up turning into a disaster with the siege at Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954. But what's not really known or talked about is that this also created a short-lived drive for huge American intervention in Vietnam. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his picture's on the bottom right, Admiral Radford, he advocated he had a program called Operation Vulture, which would involve sending airstrikes against the forces that were surrounding Dien Bien Phu. and these forces were all up in the mountains, dropping artillery shells down below into a valley that all these French forces were trapped in. And John Foster Dulles was supportive of that idea, and so is Richard Nixon. In fact, Richard Nixon takes a trip to Vietnam and gets on TV advocating for American intervention, even sending troops. I think he says if necessary. But Eisenhower says, look, he's very hesitant to do anything like this. He's also getting other views from other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in particular the head of the Army, Matthew Ridgway, Army Chief of Staff, who also succeeded MacArthur in the Korean War. And he's telling him, look, we're not going to win in Vietnam. What we pulled off in Korea was a stalemate. And this Vietnam situation is basically even more hopeless in his view. And he doesn't believe airstrikes would even work. But what people don't know, very few, I think, is that it wasn't simply conventional bombing that was being considered, but also atomic weapons. And Admiral Radford was advocating that. And hence the little picture at the top right of a Dien Bien Phu at an atomic blast off in the distance. And Ridgway makes the comment that, look, even if we drop atomic bombs around these forces, there's a good chance we'll not only kill the French, but we would still, wouldn't win. It wouldn't stop the Vietnamese from fighting, and we'd still have to send hundreds of thousands of troops there, and we probably still wouldn't even win. So in his view, the whole thing is a complete disaster. What Eisenhower does is basically say, he doesn't say no. Instead, what he does is say, okay, I got to get allies for this. So John Foster Dulles, it's not just the United States, in France, in Vietnam here, the British are allies, Australians, and so forth. So go to England and see if you can get the British on board. And also, we got to get Congress on board. The American people have to be behind this. This is a complete disaster for Truman when he got involved in Korea. It probably cost him his presidency. I don't want to get sucked in this either. And he also makes the same sort of criticisms that Kennedy does, in the sense that, what the French are doing, the phrase Eisenhower uses in one of the national security meetings, is creating a rat hole. And he doesn't think these Vietnamese will fight for us until we give them some sort of independence, and the French aren't doing it. So the French need to do it. So it's the same sort of trap that's being set up. But the whole debate flows out into the US Senate. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, he's in the top left there. He goes to the Senate and he wants to get a resolution passed, much like the future Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that would give Eisenhower the right to intervene, basically a blank check in Vietnam. That's his intention. However, his intention is blown up because General Matthew Ridgway appears and denounces the whole idea of intervention in Vietnam. There's the senators in attendance, they ask critical questions. Radford's there advocating for intervention. They asked Radford, if this is such a good idea. One of the senators asked him, then why are other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed to it? Radford says, I've spent more time in the Far East than any of them, and I understand the situation better. So I think that's a humorous, hubris type remark. But out of this, Kennedy and Barry Goldwater actually emerge as the leading opponents of this intervention. They give the most strident speeches against it. Some other senators cede their time to them. Kennedy tries to get, actually, I think both of them together, they try to get a bill or amendment attached to French aid that would demand that France give their independence. That's kind of shot down by Senate leaders after Eisenhower or someone in the Eisenhower administration contacts LBJ and says, look, you don't need to put this in there because that's just going to make the French and the Vietnamese look bad, and we'll just do, this is just what we want to do anyway. So, but that's a key moment, in 1954. And, but there's more to it than that, even. So it seems cockamamie, why in the world would you want to intervene in Vietnam when General Ridgway doesn't want to? He's not the only one. There's no, the prospects of success are very small, but that's kind of the story of Vietnam in 1961, 1964, continuous. Why is this place so captivating, a place, that captures people's imaginations to want to do something there? And the answer is, I believe that Vietnam, in the views of people such as Admiral Radford in 1954, and General LeMay and some of the General Lemnitzer, some of the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the 1960s, is that it's not simply one little hotspot. And it's not simply the domino theory in the sense that if Vietnam were to fall, then Thailand, which is next to it's going to fall, perhaps Indonesia, perhaps the Philippines, and so forth. But instead, they're viewing it as a proxy for who is going to actually control Southeast Asia and perhaps the entire region. Is it going to be the United States, who has the predominant power in 1954, or China, which is seen as an emerging power? And here's Admiral Radford himself in 1972. He tells this to a New York Times reporter. The only military solution was to go to the source of the right after Dien Bien Phu falls, there's a meeting held at John Foster Dulles' house, sort of a lobby to intervene in Vietnam. Admiral Radford's there, Richard Nixon's there, some of Radford's aides are there, John Foster Dulles is there, obviously, and someone takes notes of a comment Admiral Radford makes, and this is his motivation for wanting to do this Operation Vulture. And possibly even use atomic weapons. The only military solution was to go to the source of the communist power in the Far East, China, and destroy that power. The admiral indicated that he did not believe we would at any point in the future be confronted with as a clear-cut a basis for taking measures directly against China was the case now in Indonesia. Actually, that should say Southeast Asia. But he says that during this meeting. And in 1972, to a New York Times reporter, he tells them that the real reason he wanted to intervene in Vietnam and do this Operation Vulture was to create a regional war that would enable them to go to war with China, which they thought they could win because at the time, China had no nuclear weapons. Well, that made it itself seem crazy. How could we even win? We'll get to that in a few minutes. So after the fall of Dien Bien Phu, there's a few strands of thought about how to deal, with Southeast Asia and the world as a whole. Kennedy picks up on one of them, and these different strands of thought all are there when Kennedy takes office. And I think they're kind of the key takeaways I want you to have from this presentation. So one strain of thought comes from John Foster Dulles. And he accepts the idea that we're not sending military forces over there. Eisenhower really doesn't want to do it. There's no political will to do it. So he personally just drops it. In fact, he soon, within weeks, attends a hearing at Congress and says, we might have to give up Vietnam. And I no longer am 100% sure the domino theory is valid. And his Undersecretary of State does that. What's going on is that at the moment, they're backtracking, trying to make Vietnam not as important in case the whole thing ends up collapsing. But he comes up with his own program, and that is to create alliances that could serve as tripwires against the communist bloc, whether it's the Soviet Union or China, get blocks of nations to ally with each other so that if China were to invade one of them, they would all retaliate together. So they do that in Southeast Asia with Laos, Cambodia, Australia, England, United States, South Korea, Japan. Get Pakistan in, it's called SEATO. And in Vietnam itself, after the French surrender, there's negotiations in Geneva, and we get Ho Chi Minh and Giap because they're being pressured actually by China and the Soviet Union to partition Vietnam in half. They get North Vietnam, the Republic of North Vietnam is what they call it, and the United States creates South Vietnam and installs Ngo Do Diem in power and his family to try to create a new government and new state. And in that effort, Kennedy is completely in support. In the top right picture is a picture of Diem visiting with a Catholic priest in the United States. He actually was living in the United States in the early 1950s, building support for himself in case he could get in a position where the Americans would back him to become the leader of Vietnam or play some role there, which is what ends up happening. Ed Lansdale arrives in 1954 and is head of something called the Saigon military mission. It's a CIA program, but the CIA also has its own station. So there's two CIA groups basically operating, and Lansdale's in charge of doing sabotage operations against North Vietnam, sending North Vietnamese in the division of the country that want to come to South Vietnam down there, doing propaganda, and also as Diem's case officer, CIA case officer. And he plays that role for 2 or 3 years, and then his mission's accomplished and he comes back to the United States. But these decisions to try to build a state in South Vietnam are also happening in the context of the idea that America in the 1950s, with the collapse of colonialism, should engage in nation building in the third world. That's basically, to make a long story short, a way to build an alliance with American corporations to invest in countries, which you see in places like Guatemala, let's say with the United Fruit Company, and the Central Intelligence Agency to support the governments of our choice and help them build their nation, so to speak. Walt Rostow, who I mentioned earlier, is a leading exponent of this philosophy, writes books about it, calls it modernization theory, and South Vietnam becomes sort of a touchstone for this as the years go on. But before Kennedy gets in office, there's also a massive nation building program. At one point, more money is actually being spent there than in South Vietnam or any other country in the world when it comes to foreign aid. And that's in neighboring Laos. which I'll get to in a second. But one thing, but there's another, so that's what two views of thought. Alliances, that's the John Foster Dulles idea, which, and then nation building, which Kennedy is very supportive of, as long as it's done to support nationalist forces and not simply a return to colonialism, which there are some contradictions there, but it's still a different view than the classic John Foster Dulles view, which basically will label even some of these nationalist forces, if they're not 100% supported by the CIA or allied with the United States, as troublesome, because some of them, a lot of them, want to be neutralist. And that's part of what is going on in Laos, which we'll return to in a second. But there's another view that comes out of 1954 in the loss of the French there. And the first scholar that I think has really touched on this is Gareth Porter, who wrote a book about Vietnam called Perils of Dominance. It just touches on this in an introduction, and he theorizes that 1954 was a key turning point in American involvement in Vietnam. His argument in his book is that what led to the U.S. Becoming so heavily involved there was a simple fact that we had the ability to do so without anyone really resisting us. As Kennedy comes into office, the United States has overwhelming nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union and China. China doesn't develop an atomic bomb until 1965. When Kennedy comes in office, they only have 4 ballistic missiles, intercontinental missiles, that the Soviet Union only has 4 intercontinental missiles that can reach the United States. All 4 of them are on the same launching pad, so they could have been potentially blown up before they were launched. They did have missiles in Europe, in East Germany and Poland, that could reach England. Basically, they were refurbished V2 style German rockets, but they didn't have the capability to really hit the United States. So that gave us, in the minds of some, a free rein to intervene in places without coming into enough resistance to stop us. And that's essentially the argument Gareth Porter makes. However, he sees 1954 as a turning point, and he doesn't really explain why, but he can see it was. And digging into those years that I've done, I believe it is too, for reasons I think I've shown in my book. And I'm relying on works that are put out by the military. This book, To Kill Nations, I recommend if you want to get deeper into this. It's written by a professor at the U.S. Air College. And what happens is their views of what atomic weapons can do actually start to change in 1954. After World War II, the Strategic Air Command is created, headed by General LeMay, of all these, bombers that have the capability to fly to Russia and drop all these atomic weapons on them. But all of the war planning that his staff engages in views atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs as simply bigger bombs, bigger than what he dropped on Tokyo, or bigger than, what they dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In LeMay's view, what's the difference between dropping enough bombs to burn Tokyo down and dropping one bomb, to blow up Nagasaki or Hiroshima? What's really the difference there? It's just a bigger bomb. And a lot of the rhetoric says that. And Dwight Eisenhower makes comments to that effect too, in press conferences, a nuclear weapon is just another weapon. And we can use it just like any other weapon. However, the crisis at Dien Bien Phu exposes a fallacy in this line of thought. And the problem is the head of the Air Force, General Matthew Twining, Operation Vulture got shot down. General Matthew Ridgway showed that it doesn't really make sense to drop 4 atomic bombs, to try to wipe out a couple forces. You're not really going to win a war like that. The politicians in Congress won't, do something like that or accept it. So how do we ever what good are these weapons if we can't really use them? Because what LeMay's planning for is basically a repeat of the type of conventional bombing campaigns that he carried out first in Europe and then against Japan, in which you target the industrial base of a society and completely destroy it. And he's just like, well, I got bigger and better bombs now. And instead of doing it over weeks or months, we can just do it in one big campaign, but it's basically the same thing. But what happens is some people at the top of the Air Force realize, well, we're never going to really probably be allowed to do that. And that is a problem, because if we're building all these bombers, all these nuclear weapons, and we can't really resolve flash fire insurgencies or smaller conflicts using them, then we might be in trouble as a service. We might not get as much funding. We might not have a role in the next conflict. And the way the military operates at the higher levels, right below the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there's a planning staff of several hundred officers whose job it is to engage in what on the face of it looks like contingency plans. If we have a war here, how are we going to fight it? However, the act of planning for such conflicts has a lot of implications, because you have to involve every branch of the armed services in it. They all have to have a role. So what's the role of the Air Force? If there's a regional war, let's say, in Vietnam or Laos, what's the role of the Air Force going to be? They got to have a role. They're part of the military. If we don't give them a role, then the planning staff isn't going to operate correctly, because the people on the planning staff, they're promoted from the different branches of the armed services. And all this planning has a lot of implications for the budget, all these branches of the military are going to get. So that is one of the most important and consequential areas of the national security state, this planning staff. So out of this problem that the Air Force realizes it has over the usage of nuclear weapons, there's an internal debate and an internal study titled Project Control. It lasts for almost 12 months, and it comes out with a study that concludes that there is a way we could have used atomic weapons in South Vietnam, or could, if given the opportunity, could have at Dien Bien Phu, or could have given the opportunity in that region or somewhere else. And they do a historical study looking at World War II and the history of air power, presenting counterfactual counter histories of how, if this would have happened, we could have done this differently. I call them fantasies in my book because you can't prove that the scenarios would have worked. They're just like hypotheticals. But to make a long story short, they come up with an idea that instead of doing a mass all gigantic attack against the Soviet Union, what you could do is sort of a blackmail operation where you start out with a low level of tense political situation where there's increasing tensions. You can do this through diplomacy at first, and then you would send intimidating air flights, spy flights across the Soviet Union first as an intimidation tactic, and then you make ultimatums. The goal is to get the Soviet government to collapse, but you make ultimatums. The ultimatums aren't met, and then you start dropping conventional bombs, and then you start dropping atomic or nuclear bombs. Not all at once. You're not trying to wipe everyone out, but the idea is the overflights or reconnaissance and intimidation flights, and you're going to wipe out their air force and their limited strategic nuclear capability next, and then you can drop nuclear weapons slowly until they finally capitulate and surrender. So this is a way to do a smaller, limited usage of nuclear weapons and actually win without destroying the entire world. But it's predicated on the fact that theoretically we could get away with it because the Soviets don't have enough weapons to strike back. So they use the Soviet Union as an example. And in that book, To Kill Nations, some of the other Air Force officers kind of present this as a way to operate or win a guerrilla war. Drop one weapon or just a few and make everyone just surrender under the threat of complete annihilation. Basically, what happened, the way the war against Japan came to an end. However, after this study, there's a debate in a couple of National Security Council meetings about China and about whether to use atomic weapons first in 1954. First of all, there's a couple of meetings about China following the Dien Bien Phu crisis, and and it's asked, should we go to war against China? How should we deal with China? And there's a presentation to Eisenhower of like 5 different possibilities. The first one is just basically peaceful coexistence. The most extreme possibility is attack them, make some ultimatums, then attack them right now before they get an atomic weapon and we can't do it. Eisenhower doesn't, go with that. He doesn't go with the idea of simple peaceful coexistence, which would mean do nothing. But they come out instead saying, okay, we'll just make an ultimatum to China that says, if you invade, if you're an aggressor against another country, then we will have a real war. And that's, I believe, a sort of a understanding, I guess is a way to put it, between the two countries. I don't think it's ever was officially stated that way, but it's certainly an understanding that, appears in negotiations and so forth from time to time. But there's also another, in part of that debate about China, Eisenhower also makes statements that he doesn't think you can win conventional war in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. And the thing to do is just to support indigenous forces as long as, they're supportable and don't lose on their own. But there's also a debate about this first usage of nuclear weapons and what to do with the Soviet Union. And that debate ends with NSC 544, which is a statement of national security policy. What's our policy going to be, basically? What's the presidential policy against this, about this, the Soviet Union? And it states in there that we're not going to have a first strike or start a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And again, there's a debate, and Matthew Ridgway makes the same arguments that you can't win anyway. If we did somehow blast the Soviet Union with atomic weapons, then what do you win? He makes that argument because you've completely devastated this massive portion of the world, and you got to now go there and rebuild it or help it rebuild. So what's the point of it? And Eisenhower makes the statement that it's impossible for the United States to use nuclear weapons first. However, if we're attacked, then we'll be able to use them. He makes an argument that politically, that's just the way it is. If we use them first, we would lose our allies, which interestingly enough, President Kennedy makes the same argument in the Cuban Missile Crisis against intervening or invading Cuba, that if we do these things, if we start a war, we'll lose England and France and European allies. So when you combine these two elements together, what you have is nation building and a nuclear arms race. This overwhelming nuclear superiority the United States has is going to eventually come to an end. Everyone knows that. So there's a window of opportunity if you want to use them or think you need to use them. And these two things come together in Laos as in April 1961. So what's happening in Laos is out of the Geneva Convention 1954, it's created as a country too, although there had been kingdoms there for hundreds of years. Historically, it was a neutralist kingdom caught between China, Thailand, and Vietnam that itself is landlocked, no access to the ocean. In the 1950s, there's only one road in the entire country. Most of the people don't even have a high school education. There's only there's one real city, and it's small, and there's like 2 or 3 towns. I mean, there's one road. It's like one of the most primitive countries in the entire world. It actually still is today. And this becomes a Cold War hotspot. And John Foster Dulles sees it as one of these places critical in the Cold War. We've got to create a nation there. So all this money gets funneled to Laos. It becomes the biggest recipient of foreign aid for, I think in 57, 58, 59. And there's a small military contingent, I think 100 or so Americans that are training Laotian government forces. And there's CIA people, a couple, not many, but a handful of CIA people also there too, supervising aid going to the Laotian government and also airdrops and so forth. Because what's going on is in reality, it's not simple, even though there's forces that say they're communist and you have this royal Laotian government, in reality, these factions actually go back decades, if not longer, because they're really tribal factions and they're related to each other. So the prime minister of Laos, he's not the king, but he's the prime minister. He's the brother of the head of the Pathet Lao. That's the name of the communist forces. And they're being supported by the North Vietnamese. And what ends up happening is the programs of sending all this aid over there, they don't work very well. A lot of it runs into corruption. In fact, the story of it, I'm not going to go into all the details, but it makes the idea of nation building almost a complete joke. I mean, if you think recent events of Iraq or Syria are bad, this is probably one of the worst examples as far as being a failure there has ever been. And the programs are so dysfunctional that one of the big problems is that the default historical default for Laos is to be neutral. They don't want to ally 100% against China or against Vietnam, because historically they never did that. And that's what John Foster Dulles and the CIA are basically demanding. So the prime minister isn't 100% in congruence with what they want to do, and he tells the American ambassador that. So what the CIA does is overthrow him. They install a general called Fumi Nosvan to take his place, and then one of his officers revolts against him. It forms, a third force. So you got Novasan, this other person named Kong Lee, who had been a CIA asset, but then he revolts. It turns the day before he revolts, he's having dinner or at a bar with a bunch of CIA case officers. Then he doesn't tell them what he's going to do, and then he makes a coup on the Capitol. It only lasts for a short period of time, and he ends up having to leave when Fumi comes back. But you have these basically three forces against each other: the Pathet Lao, Kong Lee, Fumi, and it's sort of a complete disaster. And then Kong Lee allies himself with the Pathet Lao, and you have a low-grade civil war basically going on. And then Kennedy's coming into office, and it looks like the Fumi forces are about to be defeated, and the CIA and the Pentagon are demanding that he stop them and send American forces and intervene if necessary. Now, Kennedy is extremely skeptical of all this. There's an American ambassador to South Vietnam who comes to Washington, D.C. The picture, if you can see him, of Kennedy next to this gentleman, that's the American ambassador, Winthrop Brown. He tells Kennedy in a meeting that lasts, I think, an hour, that this whole thing is a complete disaster, that Fumi is useless, that he's corrupt, that he's not even a good general, that he can't win, that the country should be neutral anyway, and the whole thing is basically hopeless. And Kennedy listens to that, takes it very seriously. So he wants a solution that can neutralize Laos, minimize it in the Cold War conflict while being under pressure to intervene there. And that pressure is coming just after the failure of the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, which of course Kennedy is, being under criticism for by people in the Pentagon and the Central Intelligence Agency. But what I didn't know until doing the research for this book were what the implications for that intervention were. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, their planning staff, had a war plan called CETO Plan 5. And it was a plan for regional war, starting with the war in Laos, in a ladder of escalation if necessary. So the first step was basically, if Laos needed assistance, you send some men over there, send a couple companies of men. And then if they come under siege, those men come under siege, you're going to use bombers to bail them out or prevent them from being overrun. If the North Vietnamese, and assume that they would be all part of this, if they're intervening in Laos, then you would have to bomb them. And then if China gets involved as a reaction to that, then you drop atomic weapons on China. So in other words, the whole blueprint of this CETO Plan 5, the implications, if it all played out, was a regional war, which would culminate with the usage of atomic weapons if it came down to it. And that's what was being presented to Kennedy. And Kennedy asked, there's a series of meetings about Laos, and he asked all these pointed questions of, if we send troops to Laos, and they land at the airport, Are they going to be put under siege? If they're put under siege, you know, what's going to happen? You know, how effective is all this going to even be? Because Laos is a landlocked country. How do you even send an effective force there? So here's some quotes from these meetings surrounding this situation. Kennedy holds one of the most fascinating National Security Council meetings, I think, ever. Perhaps unique. I don't know if there's ever been one like this during this crisis, in the sense that it's not just a small number of people. Most of these meetings, you know, you get a couple, you get some staffers, National Security Council, you get representatives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, you know, a dozen or so people. He holds an interesting meeting where he's got dozens of people, and they're not just national security state people. He's got J. Edgar Hoover in the meeting. He's got senators in the meeting, congressmen in the meeting, because what he's doing is he's showing people outside the national security state what is really going on with this Laos situation and what the implications of intervening there are. And the representatives of the military, General Lemnitzer, Admiral Radford, they give presentations of the CETO Plan 5, and the politicians don't want anything to do with about it. Richard Russell makes a comment that this is all an incredible fantasy, involvement in Laos. Every single civilian there that attends is against it. But General Lemnitzer makes a comment: if we are given the right to use nuclear weapons, we can guarantee victory. After, you know, some people such as Russell are against this, Admiral Radford, who's head of the Navy at the time, makes a statement: no one wants to fight, but where do we fight? India, Iran, or where? General LeMay makes a comment in one of these meetings that he did not think the Chinese would escalate, but believed, on the contrary, we should work to go on China itself and let Chiang, who's head of Taiwan, take Hainan Island. General Thomas White, also of the Air Force, says, I believe that war with China is inevitable if we take decisive action in Southeast Asia, and I would seize the initiative. Admiral Burke, actually, I made a mistake there when I said no one wants to fight. It shouldn't be Radford, that should be Burke. Burke makes the comment: the main question to be faced was the fact that we are going to have to fight the Chinese anyway in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years. And that was just a question of when, where, and how. And finally, one last one I'll throw in there at you is that in that case, we should fight soon, since the Chinese will have nuclear weapons with 1 or 2 years. That's General LeMay. So this is the thinking process. And you know, why these people seem to think war is inevitable, I've never seen that explained, but that's a common statement, I would say, from 1954 to 1963 among most, especially in the 60s, most members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from one moment to another. So lucky for Kennedy, what happens in Laos is that there's a ceasefire. The two forces, the Pathet Lao and the Nosabon, Phumi Nosabon forces, basically neither one of them are very effective at fighting each other, and they basically end up in a stalemate and want a ceasefire, and that sort of ends the crisis. And then over the next year, there's attempts to, you know, make that ceasefire in stone. It ends up breaking down later, but the crisis passes. But once again, Kennedy did not intervene, as some were calling him to do. And in the words of Arthur Schlesinger, who was an advisor and privy to these events, he's advisor to Kennedy, he says, as a result of this, quote, JFK had made a de facto deal with the national security establishment. If it went along with neutralization in Laos, he would do something for resistance in Vietnam. So immediately after the Laos situation comes to a pass, there's reports that the situation in South Vietnam is starting to deteriorate more. And Kennedy sends LBJ at first to go there. After the Joint Chiefs of Staff are rebuffed from intervening in Vietnam, they're basically immediately asking for troops to be sent to Vietnam. I mean, I misspoke, I think. Immediately, when they're rebuffed from intervening in Laos, they then want to send troops to Vietnam. LBJ is sent to Kennedy as a result to South Vietnam, comes back with a report. And then the Rostow-Taylor trip happens, and Kennedy makes the decision to create that so-called joint program. In the words of the Pentagon Papers study, Kennedy's decision to send advisors and more aid to Vietnam is, in their words, a minimal commitment. To me, in hindsight, looking back, it's not a turning point of the war. It's a sort of an add-on to programs that were already in place, and the real turning points come later with the death of Diem, and then the death of Kennedy and the days immediately follow. Interestingly enough, there's a decision made by the North Vietnamese to escalate in South Vietnam, and a coup takes place in North Vietnam in the hours following the Kennedy assassination, which is so that's a hidden turning point in the war itself that as Americans, we don't think about, much less even knew about, probably 10 years ago. So to close out, I believe what I've described with the Joint Chiefs of Staff's hawkish views of the global situation, with its overwhelming nuclear superiority that would diminish in a few years, collide with Kennedy, and this situation will repeat with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some of the same arguments show up again. So I'm going to end my presentation, and I hope I've handed off some new ideas and thoughts to you, and to let John Newman pick up the rest of the Kennedy administration.
All right, that's an excellent presentation, Mike. I mean, you really did set the platform the way I wanted it, leading into John Newman's talk, and there's a perfect bridge between Eugenio's talk and then your talk, and now
I went much longer than I probably should have here, so
it's all right. We're under no time constraint, so that's fantastic. We wanted as complete a conference as possible, and people. The nice thing about being on the internet is that if people get exhausted or they need to go to sleep, they know that the video is going to be there. And so that was excellent. So why don't we move into some Q&A? Let me remind everyone that if you want to ask questions, it has to be done through the Q&A button, not the chat button. But we got a few very, very good questions. I've been reviewing them. Okay, the first one, Mike from Howard says, what do you think was the goal of the national security state through its desire to send U.S. troops to Vietnam? If some of the folks thought that it would be a failure to send troops, why would the NSC still send troops? I don't get what the point of the actions were to support this thing.
You broke up for a second there. I didn't get the last half of that.
Okay. Howard says, what do you think was the goal of the national security state through its desire to send U.S. troops to Vietnam? If some of the folks thought that it would be a failure to send troops, why would they send troops anyway? I don't get what the point was.
Yeah. So in our, in hindsight, looking back from our vantage point of today, we see what happened when when the United States sent hundreds of thousands of troops in 1965. It was a complete disaster. And as I mentioned, there were many people who in the military who stated it would be a disaster. General Matthew Ridgway was just one of them, but there is widespread skepticism. And a lot of it is they were skeptical because that's basically what happened in Korea. We didn't win the Korean War in the sense of defeating North Korea completely. We had a stalemate there. So why would they ever want to do this? Well, I believe that wasn't actually what they didn't want to get to, that end point of having hundreds of thousands of troops fighting a purely conventional war. Instead, they just wanted to get a force in place so that it could then become a regional war, and that they thought they could win. That if they could use enough conventional weapons and even atomic weapons, that it would be such overwhelming force that the North Vietnamese and China as their ally would just capitulate. Now, I don't believe that's what would have happened, but I think that's what they were viewing it as. They wanted to implement CETO Plan 5 when they're speaking about Laos. And what I found is that plan was dropped in 1962 and replaced with planning on, they just took out Laos and put Vietnam in that regional war plan. And that type of war planning is what Lyndon Johnson was encountering in 1964. So after Kennedy dies, there's basically a similar type of plan presented to Johnson, where we would do these escalatory steps. And the final step is atomic bombs, nuclear weapons being used against China. And Johnson, Johnson doesn't really get us deeply involved in Vietnam until it's too late to do that plan. Until the Chinese invent an atomic bomb. They test an atomic bomb in 1965, and then, in the fall of 64, early 65, and then Johnson starts to send the troops. So in the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that wasn't the war that they wanted to fight, the one that we ended up fighting. They wanted to fight a war that you could use overwhelming conventional bombs and even atomic weapons. Interesting enough, I've got a textbook. I should go get it and hold it up, but it's used at the War College, and there's a Defense University that basically has a chapter. It's a textbook for people going into the national security state or rising up the ranks of the officer corps, and it makes this argument I just made in it.
Okay. Jay asks, during the 1950s and early 60s, how much was the U.S. public aware of the debate within the national security state regarding whether to enter Vietnam militarily? Was this mostly behind closed doors, or was some of it conducted publicly?
Well, I think it's hard for me to answer that because I don't know, what it was like to be alive back then, but I believe it was not very well known at all. Obviously, people knew we were supporting the French. I don't think people knew at all how serious the debate was to go to war or to intervene seriously in 1954. Now, there is a story in the New York Times. The title is something like "The Day We Almost Went to War," about it and about, John Foster Dulles wanting to go to war. It was fairly detailed. But other than that, I don't think people had really any idea at all how serious it was, much less what the different viewpoints inside the national security state was at all. So I think the knowledge is very superficial, but people, obviously, there was propaganda, I would call it that, about, DM and the need to support him, and nation building in general. In Laos, the Reader's Digest had articles about both places. There are movies about it. Jim Diogenio mentioned The Ugly American, The other one slips my mind. There are books and novels about it.
Okay. Charlie says, how much influence did the CIA and Allen Dulles have in pushing for intervention in Vietnam in order to gain access to opium to fund Operation Gladio?
Well, I don't really see much evidence that Allen Dulles really had that hands-on when it comes to Vietnam. I mean, he sent Ed Lansdale over there in 1954, but other than that, I don't have, any memos or real evidence that he was directly, engaged in it on a close basis, other than, Lansdale's over there and he reports back, every once in a while. But other than that, I think it was just a sideshow in his mind.
Okay. Brent says, Sorensen told me JFK reached out to Galbraith to open back channel negotiations. Did it pan out according to your research?
Well, so John Kenneth Galbraith, he was ambassador to India during the Kennan administration, and he was very critical of America's support of Diem and intervening in Vietnam, period. He just didn't think it would be effective. And he wrote memos to Kennedy to that effect. And Kennedy, what Galbraith he made a proposal to JFK in 1961 to neutralize Vietnam, to, instead of just supporting Diem, to try to make some sort of deal like had been done in Laos, although that deal fails, but to try to neutralize it, to say, okay, Ho Chi Minh can be there. They'll make some sort of coalition government with Diem, and they just won't ally, 100% with China and the Soviet Union. It'll be kind of like Yugoslavia was. And Kennedy, according to Roger Hilsman, who was in the State Department and an advisor on these issues, says that Kennedy was receptive to that idea and had some support from Averell Harriman, who was also in the State Department. However, they couldn't really get it to go anywhere because no one else was for it and the timing just wasn't right. And Kennedy himself said to some of these people that I would like to neutralize it basically, but I can't until Diem is on a stronger footing. It just won't work. So that's the extent that it went. In 1963, there were some attempts to try to neutralize Vietnam. I think Galbraith was a go-between in one of them, but ironically, another one was done by Diem's brother, New. The situation was starting to fall apart. Their regime was starting to fall apart. This was after the famous photographs get released around the world of these religious monks burning themselves, these Buddhist monks, and their regime was tottering. And New sent some feelers out to the North Vietnamese to neutralize. Nothing came of it. It's hard to know how serious he was, but the Central Intelligence Agency picked it up. So there were attempts, is the point I'm making. They just didn't really get anywhere.
Okay, Douglas says, please discuss the importance of NSC 68 in 1950 in creating a permanent war state during peacetime. And do you believe we are still living with this legacy today? And let me preface this question. It's an interesting question. Let me preface the question is, would you tell us what was really significant about converting the federal government to a national security state after World War II? I mean, what changed? Why is that an important watershed? And then if you'd go into the importance of what this NSA 68 was 5 years later.
Well, one simple way to explain that is that during World War II, in World War One, and all the wars before the creation, everything before the creation of that 1947 Act, the Defense Department was called the War Department. And war was seen not as a permanent fixture. You know, we're not going to have a permanent, endless war. No president's going to announce that, you know, I'm going to have a permanent, endless war and we're just going to do this forever. Instead, you know, wars were seen as what they traditionally have been, and that is politics by another means, a temporary situation. And so the military would kind of shrink and grow in size based on whether or not we're in a conflict until the end of World War II. I mean, before World War II, there wasn't even, I think, 100,000 people in the armed services. Today, there's over 1 million people working in the Defense Department. It's the third highest employer in the United States. Walmart's number one, Amazon's number two, and then the Defense Department. But what happens in 1947 is the War Department's done away with. It's called the Defense Department, and that implies a need for a permanent war footing. And the existence of nuclear weapons and atomic bombs is deemed to make that necessary. We're at an atomic bomb, a nuclear war, a nuclear weapons race in which war, we're told, could have happened at any moment. So that makes this into a permanent crisis. And then you have the Cold War grow out of that. And that's a new type of conflict. You know, what is a Cold War? I don't think that's a phrase that had ever been used until 1946. And those type of philosophies culminate quickly in that NSC 68, which you mentioned. In that document, I write about that in my book, The War State, but one of the things it says in there is that the United States, at the time, the enemy is the Soviet Union, and it's focusing on the Soviet Union. Hardly mentions China at all, but it says that there's two things going on in the document. One, it says, okay, we've got all these atomic weapons, but the Soviet Union is going to start to get them, and they might get more than us. So we've got to have a giant weapons program in order to face that potential threat. And that creates a giant arms race and increases the defense budget. That didn't really start accelerating until the passage of this document. The Korean War also happens around the same time, which helps, but this is going to be a permanent basic situation. It's not just a situation in Korea. But the other thing it says is that it's the job of the United States to maintain order around the world, and that disorder, even if there's no Soviet Union, it says we need to do this. That any disorder is, the word is intolerable, like somehow it's going to become a threat to us. And both those philosophies, I believe, continue to this day. Even though the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and I'm someone who's I grew up, on Army bases. My father worked in the Pentagon, and I remember when the Berlin Wall fell, he toasted to that. His life was about being a part of that Cold War, and he saw the victory, but the defense budget, the national security establishment did not go away, did not shrink. It's only gotten even bigger since that great fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember watching on television with my dad, and so I think we just have continued justifications for it. the war on terror was a justification after 9/11, and that is kind of passing away in public consciousness. And now it's great power competition. When Trump was president, or actually go to Obama, when Obama was president, he spoke of recalibrating American foreign policy to meet a challenge of China. And then when Trump got in office, his national security staff released a document stating that we now face great power competition, and pointing at China and Russia as our chief competitors, but primarily China. And now Biden's getting into office, or has gotten in office, and I don't think there's any sign of that changing. I mean, Biden himself has called China a threat. It's just a matter of he's saying he's going to deal with it a little bit differently than Trump did, at least in rhetoric. But in terms of how do we deal with it? You know, the solution seems to be the same as what was in NSC 68, just more military force, more weapons, more arms, and so forth. But I would contend we didn't win the Cold War because we built more weapons, but because their whole system was so inefficient and rotten that it collapsed on its own. I know some would believe that Ronald Reagan's acceleration of the defense budget bankrupted the Soviet Union, but I think the real history suggests that the Soviet Union was going bankrupt anyway. And so my takeaway is that today, simply engaging in an arms race with China or trying to do a budget where we take all of the nuclear weapons out of the ground and replace them with new ones isn't a conducive way to deal with what I will say are potential threats. I'm not going to say there are no threats, but from a national security standpoint, but I think there's better ways to deal with them.
All right. Well, you sort of alluded to another question by Douglas. He says, well, in NSC 68, Dean Acheson and Paul Nitze sold a false myth to the American people when they described the USSR as intent upon global domination. He's asking, do you feel that was a false myth?
Oh, yeah, definitely do, for sure. You know, well, what's his name? George Kennan. He was an ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II, and he wrote this famous so-called long telegram when he was over there in the final months of the war, saying that, okay, World War II is ending, but we're now going to head for a confrontation with the Soviet Union because they are an expansionist power. They have a communist ideology, and they're now going to be a threat. However, he said the way to deal with that threat is containment, which he saw as primarily diplomatic and economic. And the Marshall Plan sort of comes out of that. George Kennan supported the national security state. He goes and works for, actually not directly for the Central Intelligence Agency, but something that becomes a part of it. He's involved in covert operations and supervising them, but he turns against the increase in militarization implied in NSC 68 with the argument that we've contained them, that we've actually, you know, by 1947, in the failure or the success, I should say, of the Berlin airlift, we've actually completely contained these people, and they're not going to be able to expand. And therefore, we don't need to overreact, much less get involved in reckless wars. He becomes a critic of intervening in Vietnam. So definitely is what I think they made a mistake in militarizing everything in NSC 68. But there are people, prominent people at the time, who thought the same thing.
Okay. John asks, what role did the Berlin crisis play in JFK's decisions on Vietnam and Laos in 61? Not really
Yeah.
sure
Okay.
that,
Yeah. For people who don't know, when the question's asking about the Berlin crisis, what happens after World War II, there's East and West Germany are created. Berlin's in East Germany though. So it's in a Berlin is a divided city with a Western side and Eastern side inside of a Warsaw Pact country. So it's sort of an isolated, area, and there's no Berlin Wall. And what's happens in the 50s is that there's people living in the Eastern Bloc and in East Germany that go to West Berlin as a way to get out of the Soviet system and have more freedom. And this becomes a giant problem for the East Germans, because what's happening is they're draining away or losing a lot of their most intelligent and resourceful people who want more freedom. And it's not simply, a bad look, bad propaganda or bad image, but it's hurting their society. And Khrushchev becomes under pressure to try to do something about this. So he wants some sort of way to stop all this. And he creates a crisis when Eisenhower's president, to try to make Berlin just a part of East Germany. He doesn't really have a definitive thing of what he wants accomplished, but he wants this drain of people to go away. He wants, West Berlin to become part of East Berlin, or some sort of way to stop all this. And he threatens war, or says, if we don't get a settlement, it'll lead to war, basically. And then sort of a crisis environment is created under Eisenhower, and then it just passes. He kind of just makes a bluff and then doesn't carry out with it. And then the same basic situation happens in 1961, except the rhetoric is even more serious. And Kennedy meets it by calling up military forces, by activating members of the National Guard. He's under pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to do more than that. And then the crisis suddenly passes when Khrushchev comes up with the solution of building the Berlin Wall, dividing the city of Berlin. So now people can't cross over and escape the Soviet system. So I'm getting away from what the actual question was.
Well, what role did the Berlin crisis play in JFK's decision on Vietnam and Laos, which really goes beyond your
Okay.
talk?
Yeah. So the crisis happens after Laos and before the November NSAM to send more aid to South Vietnam. So it's in between, and it does play a role in his decision to intervene more or send more material and men to South Vietnam, because it also interpreted as Kennedy being weak. He didn't, go to war. He didn't make really dire threats. He just called up people and said, we're in a crisis, but he didn't, do some of the things people, again, in the Pentagon were asking him to do. And there's a meeting actually with, I think it's Lemnitzer, but one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of Robert McNamara, where he's got like a memo written by all of them saying, you need to intervene here. Don't be weak. Don't run away. Basically, McNamara takes it, says, okay. So that was their kind of attitude.
Okay, PK says, can you please take the time to expand on the discussion regarding the North Vietnamese coup after Kennedy's murder? Again, that goes far beyond your talk, but you did mention it. So
it's something that it's a turning point in the war. So what happens is in 1954, with the Geneva Conference, when they create South Vietnam and North Vietnam, obviously Ho Chi Minh and Giap, they want a united country. And they're probably expected to have one by winning this war. But the Soviets and the Chinese basically say, no, you're going to split the country. And because we don't want this war to go on. We don't want the United States to come in. And at the time, Khrushchev wants a thaw in the Cold War. So he doesn't want this to be a crisis hotspot. He kind of just wants it to go away. The Chinese don't want to get deeper involved. And what they tell Ho Chi Minh and Giap is that don't worry about it, because you're going to have North Vietnam. You're going to you're going to build a strong state there in Diem, and the Americans, they probably won't last anyway. This Diem project will probably collapse, and you won't have to have a serious war, and you'll be able to just walk on in, basically. So they take that view themselves. They have a Politburo in North Vietnam, and the two of them make the argument that to the other members of the Politburo in North Vietnam that we really do need to focus on North Vietnam and build it up as good as we can into a strong state before we ever think about having a war in South Vietnam. We need to really focus on us first, our country first. Not everyone agrees. There's a figure named Le Duan who was in charge during the French War of forces in the South, in what becomes South Vietnam. And once the country's divided, he's in charge of the guerrilla forces in South Vietnam. And Diem actually surprises everybody in the first couple of years of his rule, and is more effective than people expect in America and in North Vietnam. And by 1959, actually has decimated much of the South Vietnamese guerrilla forces that are down there. The communist agents that were sent down there after 1954, many of them are caught. The drawback of this, though, is he's arrested about 30,000 innocent people. And so his operations against the communists sort of create a blowback in his own society. He's jailing people. And so he's built up a lot of dissent throughout the entire country, and it starts to tip against him by the time Kennedy becomes president. But what happens is in 1961, this debate inside the Politburo between Giap, Ho Chi Minh, and this Le Duan character intensifies. And Le Duan starts to get the upper hand inside the Politburo and gets them to basically create what is the VC, or known as the Viet Cong, in 1960-61. And so they start to support the guerrillas in South Vietnam more, and they start to grow in effectiveness. Now, what happens after the Kennedy assassination, is not entirely known. So what is known is that within 48 hours, there's a coup inside this Politburo, and Ho Chi Minh and General Giap are completely sidelined. Ho Chi Minh basically becomes a complete figurehead from then on. No real power at all. General Giap throughout the following years will be someone who will disappear at times and reappear. He still has an official position, but this Le Duan character, he becomes the real leader of the country and most powerful figure, and advocates immediately for further intervention on the part of the North Vietnamese into Vietnam. He says Diem's been overthrown and Kennedy has been killed, so we need to intervene now while we have a chance, because LBJ's coming in and the Americans are coming. So we better do it now before they can get established with more forces down there. Now, here's the thing that I don't know and very curious about. And they're just, as far as I know, there's only 2 books written in English, that cover this, whole situation. And how much access do these people have to North Vietnamese archives? I don't know. I don't speak the language to be able to even look at the primary sources. But what I'm curious about is this. General Giap, towards the end of his life, gave an interview in which he said that they thought, the North Vietnamese believed, that Kennedy was going to withdraw from Vietnam. Now, this is fascinating because in the United States, Peter Dale Scott made that argument. John Newman really made that argument in his book. And there's been a debate inside the United States, in scholarship, whether Kennedy was going to withdraw or not, and so forth. But if the Vietnamese believed he was, that's interesting. And why did they think that? That raises all kinds of questions. But it also makes me wonder, this is what it makes me wonder. Diem's killed, then Kennedy's killed. Are they interpreting both of those acts as a coming escalation on the part of the United States, which is how, a lot of the Kennedy assassination researchers, I believe, view it, especially the latter. And if they're interpreting it that way, that would be an explanation for why a motive factor for why this coup took place in North Vietnam. So it's there's a lot, we just think of the United States and what's going on here, but that's a huge turning point. We don't know the whole story about it.
Okay, the last question is not really a question, it's just more of an observation, a couple of observations. One, he's got an interesting point, second John. John says that the Catholic priest with Diem in that photo you showed is Francis Cardinal Spellman, America's senior Catholic prelate and military vicar of the armed forces. And then he makes a comment that beginning in 1949, Mao began to contribute significant aid in arms and advisors. Like America, China was covering 80% of the Viet Minh resources, and Chinese AAA gunners and rocket artillery even saw combat at Dien Bien Phu. So he doesn't really ask a question, he makes an observation. Do you have any desire to comment on that, or?
Yeah, sure. I don't think that's correct. A part of it's not correct, that they were contributing 80%. The reason I say that is that they were contributing advisors. There's no doubt about that. And, but they didn't have like operational control over the decisions Giap and Ho Chi Minh were making. They were definitely sending aid and support, but I don't think they're sending up to 80%. And the reason why, I don't know what the exact figure is, and I've never seen an exact figure. However, the intelligence reports the Americans would make or the French would make, they would say that most of the weapons that the Vietnamese that we're fighting against and the French were fighting against were stolen, from the French or the Americans, and not simply given to them from the Chinese. And also, one of the arguments when I mentioned John Foster Dulles going to England and trying to get the British to support intervention, one of the arguments the prime minister made was the Americans are supporting up to 80%, and the Vietnamese aren't getting much support. They don't need it. So this will never, we will never be able to match or overwhelm the Vietnamese. And then China's right there on the border anyway. So it's kind of a hopeless situation. I guess what I'm trying to argue against more is the implication that the Chinese are in control of Ho Chi Minh and Giap, and that these are really just proxy figures. And one reason I'm really against that is that that's not what happens as time goes on. You know, in the 1970s, the two sides end up supporting opposite sides in Cambodia, and then China actually invades Vietnam, I think 1979. So they're not like hand in glove allies, you know. And today, in the minds of the national security state, Vietnam is a potential ally against China.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up.
Okay.
Thank you for the great talk, Mike. So I think y'all can see now we've laid the foundation for what the situation is when Kennedy becomes president. We've seen his policy toward third world countries is diametrically opposite to the national security establishment. Mike has shown that the pressures at the national security establishment was imposing on Kennedy to intervene in various parts of the world. And early in his administration, just the mindset that they had from Dien Bien Phu on, well, since 1945, the communist threat, the international communist conspiracy based in Moscow. So with next week's talk, now we're going to move right into the Kennedy administration. John Newman, I think you'll really enjoy this talk. It is critically important. He's the author of JFK in Vietnam and renowned scholar, especially in this area. And he's going to move right into the Kennedy administration. And now you're going to see how this tension that exists between Kennedy and the military intelligence establishment, how it starts to deteriorate and what ends up being the consequence of that deterioration throughout the Kennedy administration. The situation just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So we look forward to that talk. Thank you all for tuning in. And Mike, thank you again for a great presentation.
Oh, it's great. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a privilege to speak to everyone that attended.
Yeah, thanks for attending our conference, and we'll see you all next week. Same time, same station, 7 p.m. Eastern time next Wednesday.
you